3 weeks ago, my son flew out to help his sister settle into her new place in Kelowna, and I decided to drive out and surprise them both. When I pulled up to her townhouse, the woman next door stepped off her porch and walked straight toward me. "Are you Adele's father?" she asked, before I'd even touched the front door. 40 minutes later, an RCMP constable was standing in my living room. I should back up. My daughter had moved to Kelowna in April following her husband west after he'd landed a position with a vineyard management company out there. She'd called it an adventure. Her husband, I'll call him my son-in-law because that's all he ever really was to me, had called it an opportunity. I'd driven the 400 kilometers from Kamloops twice in those first few months, helped them unpack, taken them to dinner at a place on the lakeshore. Everything seemed fine. Strained in the way new starts always are, but fine. Then my son called me from a rest stop outside Merritt. He'd been trying to reach his sister for 4 days. Not unusual on its own. She worked long hours managing the tasting room at a local winery, and their conversations had always run in fits and starts. But she'd missed their standing Sunday call, hadn't responded to texts. And when he'd phoned my son-in-law, the call went straight to voicemail both times. He thought maybe I'd heard from her. I hadn't. Not since a brief message 8 days earlier, just a photo of the lake at sunset with a single line beneath it. "Gorgeous evening. Miss you, Dad." I told him I was sure there was an explanation. That her phone had probably died, or she'd gotten wrapped up in harvest season prep. I told him not to worry. I was already walking to the garage when I hung up. The drive along the Coquihalla gives you a lot of time to think, or in my case, a lot of time to convince yourself you're overreacting. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer working on infrastructure projects from Fort St. John to Windsor, and I like to think I approach problems methodically. But this wasn't a load-bearing calculation. This was my daughter not answering the phone for 8 days, and methodical thinking kept sliding into something darker every time I passed another kilometer marker. Her townhouse was in a quiet complex south of downtown, near the Orchard Roads, the kind of neighborhood that looks like it was assembled from a catalog. Cream stucco, black trim, tidy cedar hedges. I pulled in just after 2 in the afternoon. My son-in-law's truck was gone. My daughter's small hatchback was in the carport. I got out and walked to the front door. Before I could knock, I heard the screen door of the adjacent unit swing open. A woman in her mid-50s, gardening gloves tucked under one arm, came down her front steps with a directness that told me she'd been watching for someone. "Are you Adele's father?" she said. I told her I was. She introduced herself as my daughter's neighbor. She'd lived in the unit beside theirs since before they'd moved in. Her expression wasn't alarmed exactly, but it carried something careful in it, the look of someone who'd been sitting with a decision for too long. "Something happened here last week," she said. "I've been hoping family would show up." She told me what she'd heard on the Thursday night. A raised voice, a woman's, she was certain, coming through the shared wall between their units. Not an argument exactly, more like distress. She'd heard the word "please" repeated several times. She'd gone to knock on the front door. My son-in-law had answered. He'd told her everything was fine, that his wife had had too much wine, that she was embarrassed. He'd smiled the whole time. She said the smile was what stayed with her. She'd called 911 anyway, 20 minutes later. After the sound stopped and the lights in their unit went dark at 9:30 on a Thursday when she knew my daughter had a Friday shift, the paramedics had come. They'd gone inside. They'd come back out with a stretcher. My daughter was on it. My son-in-law had not followed them to the hospital. He'd watched the ambulance leave, gone back inside, and by Friday morning his truck was gone. I stood on that walkway and I felt the ground tilt under me. Not metaphorically, I actually reached out and put my hand on the cedar hedge to steady myself. She gave me the name of the hospital, Kelowna General. She said she'd already told all of this to the RCMP officer, who'd come by the day after, but she hadn't heard anything back, and she didn't know if my daughter had any family coming. I thanked her. I don't remember exactly what I said. I was already dialing the hospital before I reached my car. 3 transfers. A ward clerk who asked me to hold. Then a nurse on the medical floor who confirmed that yes, A patient matching my daughter's name had been admitted 6 days ago and was currently stable. She wouldn't tell me anything more by phone. She told me to come in and ask for the charge nurse on the 4th floor. I called my son from the parking lot, told him to turn around and meet me at the hospital. He asked me what was wrong. I told him everything the neighbor had said, and there was a long silence on the line that I think was him pulling off the highway. Kelowna General sits on the hill above the city. I found parking, took the elevator to 4, and asked for the charge nurse. She brought me to a small consultation room just off the nursing station before she'd say anything, which told me more than her words would. My daughter had been admitted with what the hospital initially treated as a suspected overdose, a combination of a prescription sedative and a common blood pressure medication. The levels in her system were, the charge nurse said carefully, inconsistent with accidental ingestion. She had been unconscious on arrival and had remained so for most of the first 3 days. She was awake now. She was asking for her mother, who had passed 6 years ago. They hadn't been able to reach any next of kin. A plainclothes RCMP corporal was waiting for me outside her room. He'd been assigned to the file the previous day when the hospital's findings had flagged a concern. He asked me a series of questions I answered as clearly as I could. When I'd last spoken to her, what I knew about the state of her marriage, whether I was aware of any history of mental health or substance use. I told him she had neither. I told him what the neighbor had said. I told him that my son-in-law had not followed his wife to the hospital. He listened. He made notes. Then he said I could go in. She looked small. That was my first thought. My daughter is not a small woman. She's tall like her mother, broad-shouldered, the kind of person who fills a room. But in that bed, with the IV line in her arm and the monitors ticking beside her, she looked like she'd been reduced. She was awake when I came in. She looked at me the way children look at their parents when they've been frightened, and the fright has not entirely passed. I sat down beside her and I held her hand and I didn't say anything for a while. When she was ready to talk, she told me what she remembered. She and her husband had eaten dinner at home on the Thursday. Pasta. Nothing out of the ordinary. She'd felt strange within the hour, heavy-limbed, dizzy, her heartbeat doing something irregular that frightened her. She'd asked him to call an ambulance. He'd told her she was having a panic attack, that she needed to lie down, that she'd feel better in the morning. She'd tried to stand up and reach the phone herself, and he'd guided her back to the couch. Not roughly, she said. Gently. That was almost worse. She'd called out through the wall. She remembered doing that. She remembered the sound stopping when her neighbor knocked. And then she remembered nothing until the hospital. I kept my face even while she talked. I am not a demonstrative man. My children will tell you that. But I felt something close underneath that surface. Something I didn't want her to see, because it wasn't grief or fear. It was older and colder than that. The corporal took a formal statement from her that afternoon. The toxicology report had already confirmed the medication levels. Neither drug had been prescribed to her. One of them, the sedative, had been prescribed to my son-in-law for anxiety, a prescription he'd filled 3 months early. After the corporal left, I sat in the chair beside my daughter's bed, and I thought about what I knew and what I needed to know. My son arrived around 5. He sat on the opposite side of the bed, and the 3 of us stayed there until visiting hours ended, not talking much. When I kissed her forehead and told her I'd be back in the morning, she held onto my hand for a moment before she let go. I drove to a motel on Harvey Avenue, and I called a man I'd worked with on a contract dispute in 2019, a private investigator out of Vancouver named Gordon, who'd helped us trace a fraudulent subcontractor across 3 provinces. I told him I needed him to look into my son-in-law's financial situation. He told me he'd have something preliminary within 48 hours. He was back to me in 36. My son-in-law had arrived in British Columbia 14 months ago with a job offer and approximately $40,000 in personal debt that he had not disclosed to my daughter. The vineyard position had paid reasonably well, but it hadn't been enough. There were credit card balances across 4 accounts, 3 of them maxed. A line of credit secured against a truck he technically still owed payments on in Ontario. 2 payday loan accounts opened in Kelowna within his first 6 months. The total outstanding, as of the previous month, was just over $88,000. Gordon had also found something else. My son-in-law had made 2 phone calls to a law firm in Vancouver in the 6 weeks before my daughter was hospitalized. Not a firm that handled employment or real estate, a firm that specialized in estate planning and probate. My daughter, Gordon reminded me, had been listed as primary beneficiary on a $600,000 life insurance policy I'd taken out in her name when she was born and transferred to her at 25. Standard practice for our family. My son, her brother, had the same. My daughter had also recently inherited a modest amount from her maternal grandmother, roughly $70,000 sitting in a TFSA. Not a fortune, but to someone carrying $88,000 in debt. A number worth calculating. I sat with that information in the motel room, and I built the picture the way I'd learned to build engineering assessments. Fact by fact, load by load. The next morning I drove back to the hospital. My daughter was sitting up and had eaten breakfast. She looked better physically, though the thing behind her eyes hadn't shifted. I asked her gently whether she knew the state of her husband's finances. She said she'd known things were tight. She hadn't known the specifics. He'd always handled their accounts. I told her, as plainly as I could, what Gordon had found. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she asked me whether the corporal knew about the insurance policy. I called him when I left her room. He did not know. He thanked me for the information, and something in his tone changed, became more clipped, more focused. He said they'd been having difficulty locating my son-in-law. His phone had been going to voicemail since the night my daughter was admitted. His truck had last been seen on a traffic camera on Highway 97 heading south toward Osoyoos 4 days after she was hospitalized. They found him 2 days later at a motel in Penticton. He hadn't fled the province. I don't know whether that was stupidity or arrogance or something else. He'd simply been waiting. For what? I never learned. The RCMP arrested him on a Wednesday afternoon. The charges, as read to me later by the corporal, were administering a noxious substance with intent to endanger life and failing to provide the necessaries of life. Third charge, criminal negligence causing bodily harm, was added the following week once the full toxicology report had been reviewed by a Crown prosecutor. My daughter was discharged 4 days after I arrived. I drove her back to the townhouse to collect what she needed, and I stayed outside on the walkway while she packed. Her neighbor came out and stood with me. We didn't say much. At one point, she asked how my daughter was doing, and I told her she was going to be fine, which was true in the medical sense and something I believed would eventually be true in every other sense as well. Before we left, I went to the door and thanked her properly. She shook her head like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. My son drove his sister back to Kamloops in her car. I followed them in mine. She stayed with me for 3 weeks while her situation was sorted out legally, financially, practically. She had a lawyer by the end of the first week, a woman in Kelowna who specialized in family law and who moved quickly once she understood the full picture. The marriage had been less than 2 years old. The assets, my daughter's name, remained hers. The insurance policy was untouched. It did not remain a quiet story. A reporter from the Kelowna Daily Courier ran a piece 2 weeks after the arrest, based on a statement my son-in-law's family had given. His brother, specifically, who lived in Hamilton, and had apparently decided the best strategy was to call it a misunderstanding. The piece was careful enough that nothing defamatory was said outright, but the framing suggested a troubled marriage, a wife with anxiety, a husband who was being unfairly vilified. My daughter's name wasn't used. She was a minor in the legal sense of disclosure rules, but anyone who knew them locally could have made the connections. My son wanted to respond publicly. I told him not to. I'd spent 3 decades on construction projects where the paperwork eventually told the whole story, where you didn't need to argue in public because the documentation did it for you. The Crown's evidence would speak. We only needed to wait. That patience was harder than I expected. A former colleague of mine, someone I'd worked with on a bridge project in Salmon Arm years ago, called me about 3 weeks after the arrest. He'd read the article. He was careful and kind about it, the way people are when they're uncertain of what they're walking into. He asked if it was possible there'd been a misunderstanding. I told him there had not been. He said he was sorry to hear that. What I heard underneath his words was that he wasn't completely sure who to believe, and I understood that, because the article had been written to produce exactly that effect. I am not, by nature, someone who talks about what I'm feeling. My daughter takes after her mother in that regard, open, demonstrative, generous with her interior life. I am more of a closed system. But sitting in my kitchen in Kamloops that night, after that phone call, I felt something I hadn't felt in the weeks of managing and organizing and following up. I felt tired, not physically, something deeper than that. The kind of tired that comes from realizing that protecting the people you love is not a single action, but an ongoing project, and the project is not finished. And some of the people doubting you are people you thought were solid ground. My daughter found me there, sitting in the dark with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She turned the kitchen light on and sat across from me. "You're letting it get to you," she said. I told her about the phone call. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The article was written by his family to create confusion before trial. That's all it is. You know what happened. I know what happened. The toxicology knows what happened. Let the rest of it go." I looked at her across the table. She was 6 weeks out from a hospital bed, still not entirely steady, still working through what it meant that the person she'd built a life with had looked at her lying on that couch and made a calculation. And she was steadier than I was. I let it go. The preliminary hearing happened in Kelowna in November. I was not required to attend, but I drove out anyway, alone. My son-in-law appeared in the prisoner's box in a gray shirt, his hair cut shorter than I remembered it. He did not look at me. He looked at his lawyer and at the judge, and at a point somewhere above the gallery. His lawyer entered a not guilty plea, which everyone in the room understood to be procedural. The Crown's disclosure by that point included the toxicology findings, the prescription records, the call logs to the probate law firm, the traffic camera footage of his departure, and a statement from a coworker who had heard him ask, approximately 2 months before the incident, what happened to a life insurance policy if the beneficiary died. The trial was set for the following spring. My daughter flew back to Kelowna in December to finalize the separation paperwork. She took very little from the townhouse. She did not want to spend the night, so she stayed with her neighbor, who had offered without being asked. That small fact, that a woman who'd lived next door to my daughter for 8 months would open her home to her in December when everything was still raw. I think about it more than almost anything else from that period. I drove out and met her for lunch the following afternoon, at a place by the water that was mostly empty in the off-season. We talked about what she wanted to do next. She'd already been offered her old position back at a winery in Naramata, where she'd worked before the marriage. She was thinking about it. She was thinking about a lot of things. I told her I was proud of her, which I am not sure I had ever said to her directly in quite that way. She looked at me for a moment like I'd said something in a foreign language, and then she laughed, the real kind. And I laughed too, and it was the first time since April that anything had felt ordinary. The trial took place the following April, 14 months after the arrest. I will not recount every day of it. What I will say is that the Crown's case was methodical and thorough, and that the defense's attempt to characterize my daughter's hospitalization as self-inflicted collapsed under the weight of the prescription records, and the call logs and the co-worker's testimony. My son-in-law took the stand in his own defense, which his lawyer had clearly advised against, and he was not a convincing witness. He was precise in the wrong way, too careful about dates, too organized about a story that should have been emotional, and the Crown's cross-examination made that visible. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Guilty on 2 of the 3 charges. Criminal negligence causing bodily harm was reduced to the lesser included offense, which I understood from the Crown prosecutor meant the jury had accepted the poisoning but had found the intent question more complicated. The sentencing would come later. I was sitting in the second row of the gallery when the foreman read the verdict. My son was beside me. My daughter was not in the courtroom. She had decided not to attend the trial, which was her right, and which I respected completely. I called her immediately after, standing in the lobby of the Kelowna courthouse while my son went to get the car. She answered on the second ring. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. And I heard in it everything it contained. Not celebration, not relief exactly, but the sound of something being set down. He received a sentence of 4 years in federal custody, plus 3 years probation upon release, with a firearms prohibition and a no-contact order covering my daughter indefinitely. The Crown had sought more. I had learned, from my time watching trials over 30-odd years of infrastructure disputes and contract hearings, that sentencing is where the distance between justice and satisfaction most clearly shows itself. 4 years. I sat with that. What I came back to in the weeks after was this. My daughter was alive. She was in Naramata, working a harvest she'd been planning for months, living in a rental house with a view of the Vineyard Rose and a cat she'd adopted from the SPCA in September. She called me on Sundays again, the way she always had. The calls were different now. More careful in some ways, more honest in others. She talked about things she hadn't talked about before. So did I. The neighbor, the woman who had stood on that walkway and waited for someone in my daughter's family to show up, sent a card after the verdict. Handwritten, 3 lines. I still have it on the shelf in my office in Kamloops, next to the photo of the 2 of them that my daughter sent me at Christmas. I spent 32 years building things meant to hold weight. Bridges, roadbeds, the kind of infrastructure that's meant to outlast the people who made it. I know what it looks like when a structure is carrying more load than it was designed for, and I know the difference between a failure that happens suddenly and one that's been building for a long time. My son-in-law had been building toward that night for months. He'd made calls to probate lawyers. He'd researched what would happen to my daughter's estate. He'd filled a prescription and kept careful count of what was in it. None of that happened in a moment of panic. It was deliberate, patient, and cold. What stopped it was a woman in gardening gloves who listened through a shared wall and decided it was not nothing. I drove the Coquihalla home after the verdict on a Thursday in April, the mountains still carrying winter in the high passes, the valley below already in early bloom. The drive that had felt like an emergency 14 months ago felt different this time. Still long, still quiet, but underneath it, something solid. My daughter is fine. She will tell you she's fine, and for once, I believe her completely.